Okay. So can people see that share screen?
And now we have Nivek Thompson, who is going to be talking about evaluating and designing mini publics using democratic functions.
So thanks everybody for coming along. The reason I said not to say where you were from was because I've got the next slide, which I'll just click to, is an introduction to the tool that I'm using, which is Mentimeter. A lot of you may be familiar with that. And just to get us into the groove of using it, I have my first question for you is where you're joining from. So to join Mentimeter, you can either do it on your phone, scanning the QR code there, that QR code, or you can open another tab on your computer screen and go to menti.com and enter that code 32317173. And then you'll be into the entire presentation that I'm going to be running through, because I'm using Menti for the entire presentation. And yeah, I just thought using it for where you're joining from would be an easy way to get us going. We've got 3 people so far told us where they're from. Thank you. I'm just going to let you all have a go with this so that I know that you're into Menti, because that's, as I say, where I'm running the presentation, and there are a few interactive slides as well as, slides where I'm just talking. So I know that there's 9 of us, so that's 8 excluding me, and we've got 5. So we've got 4 more people to tell us where they're from. And if you're having trouble getting into Menti, let me know. You are, Jeanette?
Yep.
So did you try with your phone to scan the QR code?
Yeah, I'm having trouble with my phone. Look, just keep going without me, okay? I've got to take it back in.
Open another tab on your computer.
Just go on without me. I'll be fine.
All right.
Please.
I would like your input later on, so it would be nice if you could get in.
All right. Do it without.
So you could maybe put your input into the chat if you can't get it into the other.
Sure.
But so the first question is, what does democracy mean to you? And I'm sort of asking this to get a bit of a position on how you think about it, and that'll give me a bit of an idea about, or sort of be clear about then how I think about it.
What kind of word count do you want for this? Because I could go on.
A sentence or 2 would be great if you could keep it to that, Terry. You're sort of like you've got an elevator pitch and you're only going 2 floors.
I can't seem to get to that question in Menti. I got into Menti, but I don't see the question.
Did you see the previous question?
Only the one about where are you from?
Yeah, so it should have automatically gone to this next screen for everybody. So maybe go out and go in again or something like that, or sort of refresh the page, because it should I mean, obviously somebody's got it because I've got one answer. So
Okay, I've got it now.
So I'll just have another minute or so on this one. Just there's a lot of commonality, I guess, in how people see it. Some are seeing it sort of on a, a broader level, and some, more specifically about how it's done. While you're thinking about this, I'll tell you a bit about the background to my thesis or my research. I started my PhD in 2013. It took me a long time to do it. I did it part-time. And in a way, it was good that it took me so long, because what I wanted to do was look at whether deliberative mini-publics were actually improving democracy or not. And to begin with, I was finding it tricky, because in terms of looking at definitions of democracy and looking at indexes of democracy, certainly, like if you do it just as sort of a basic Google search, all the definitions are representative democracy. And most of the indexes, like the Democracy Barometer and so on, are focused on representative democracy. And they just sort of have a comment about participation. So it made it very difficult to identify how to evaluate whether deliberative mini-publics actually contributed to democracy overall, and not, where did they fit vis-a-vis representative democracy. So that was sort of the motivation, I guess, although the next slide I'm going to go to gives you a bit more. Does anybody want more time on this one? No? Okay, well.
Jeanette, could you put the code in the chat so that Ana Lucia Lima can get into Menti with the code?
Yep. Hold on, I've lost my, in heaven's name.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Carrie. She did it.
Oh, thank you. I can't see the chat button at the moment.
Okay, it's done.
Okay, well, I'll just leave it a moment longer then, so so people can add that in. Alrighty, I'm going to go to the next slide now, which I think really, for me, sums up my motivation for my study, for my research. So, as I said, I started my PhD in 2013, and in 2012, a book about the democratic malaise came out. And Kenneth Newton was one of the editors, and in a piece that he wrote, he said, it's often difficult to say whether an innovation has the effect of preserving the existing order by making it more efficient or effective and efficient, or whether it has succeeded in changing or even transforming the system to create something very different and ultimately better. And he goes on to say, perhaps the best we can do is leave value judgments aside whilst trying to assess whether a given innovation has succeeded in achieving at least some of its goals. And that seemed to me to be the way most people approached, you looked at participatory democracy from the perspective of, principles of participatory democracy, direct democracy the same, deliberative democracy the same. And we didn't really know whether they were being co-opted or whether they were changing things for the better. We just didn't really know. And that's exactly what I wanted to know. And so that's, one of the reasons I started my PhD. And my PhD, my thesis was called Deliberative Mini-Publics, Institutional Design and the Quality of Democracy. And I used two frameworks in my research. One was institutionalism and the other was democratic functions. Now, I'm not going to be talking about the institutionalism side of things today. I'm going to be talking about the democratic functions. And I did a number of case studies, 4 jurisdictional case studies with embedded deliberative mini-publics, and another case study where I looked at 2 institutional entrepreneurs. I'm not going to talk about that today either, but that's just to give you a bit of background. Oops. So this just gives you the overview of my jurisdictional case studies. So I looked at South Australia, where the then Labor government had run 6 mini publics, all of them called citizens juries except one, but was recruited exactly the same and run exactly the same. The government did try to suggest that the one that was called a community panel wasn't citizens jury because they gave it a different name, but it was run by, it was exactly the same. So it was recruited by New Democracy Foundation and run by a deliberative facilitator. So, and then I also looked at Kingston Council, which is in Victoria, in Australia. They ran 3 separate community panels, and then they set up standing mini publics for different wards, which were sub areas of the council. Looked at Noosa Shire Council, which ran 2 what they called community juries. Noosa's in Queensland, New South Wales, Australia, sorry. And they ran 2 in a row, one on organic waste and one on the future of the river. And then the final one was Goulburn Valley Water, which is a water authority in Victoria. And it ran a couple of small mini publics. But unlike all the others, it was actually a regulated organisation, and the requirement to consult with its customers was set by and monitored by the Essential Services Commission, which is the regulator for water authorities. So, as I said, one of the good things about taking so long to complete my PhD was that whilst in the first couple of years, there wasn't anything much to use. I mean, there was Graham Smith's Democratic Goods, and I was definitely familiar with that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But there wasn't an overall approach to, or I hadn't come across an overall approach to evaluating the contribution of different types of institutions to democracy until Mark Warren's paper in 2017 called A Problem-Based Approach to Democracy. And he basically argued that model-based approaches are limited. So like, participatory democracy, representative democracy, direct democracy, deliberative democracy, whatever else you want to have, specifically because they didn't allow cross-institutional comparisons, and you weren't really looking at them from the perspective of democracy overall. And that's, in fact, what I was wanting to do. And in my thesis, I was using democratic functions to evaluate the deliberative mini publics run in the jurisdictional cases. But my conclusion was that the functions can also be valuable to people designing deliberative mini publics, because they push you to think about particular aspects that you might otherwise not give as much attention to as you might like. And like the Sortition Foundation, I run a small consultancy recruiting mini publics. So I did find that I spent a lot more time on, I had a tendency to spend more time on the inclusion function, but my supervisor was very clear on I needed to give all of them equal attention, not just the ones I knew more about in practice. So these are the democratic functions. Now, in Mark Warren's work, he had 3 functions. So he had empowered inclusion. He combined collective agenda setting and collective will formation into one. And then he had collective decision-making. I followed some other scholars in separating collective agenda setting and collective will formation, and in adding accountability as a 5th democratic function. And so the idea is that, as Warren says, you can use these for comparative purposes between institutions. And he argues that by doing that, you could design a range of institutions that together maximize the strengths against all these functions. And minimize, I guess, the weaknesses. So the idea is that what I did was I identified the strengths and weaknesses of each of the cases against each of the democratic functions. So that's, I'll just take you now through, these are similar to Graham Smith's. Graham Smith's work was, I'm going to take you through each of the different functions, and so then that'll become a bit clearer what they cover. So Graham Smith's democratic goods, his book is about democratic innovations. So he designed those goods specifically to look at democratic innovations. There is definitely some overlap. Like, so one of his democratic goods is inclusiveness, so clear overlap. Popular control, which could cover, in fact, the next three, I guess, collective agenda setting, collective will formation, collective decision making. Considered judgment, which I think goes to collective will formation. And then he has transparency, and he has some other, sort of operational provisions that he addresses. But Mark Warren's is designed specifically to allow a broader consideration and the potential to use these functions in other areas. And I certainly, whilst my thesis looks at them in relation to deliberative mini-publics, and this presentation's about that, I think they could be used for other democratic innovations and public participation initiatives to improve how they contribute to democracy. So what I had to do, you can imagine, like, just looking at all these and saying, so was there inclusion? Wouldn't have worked very well. So I needed to operationalize each of the functions so that I could then interrogate the case studies and see to what extent, what were the strengths and weaknesses of each case study in regard to each democratic function. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about my conclusions regarding specific cases. What I'm doing, the purpose of today's session from my perspective is, when I operationalized the democratic functions as part of my thesis, I did it based on literature review and my own knowledge of deliberative mini-publics from working with New Democracy Foundation and running my own small consultancy. One of the things I noted in my conclusion was that I didn't have time to test this operationalization with other people in the deliberative democracy community. And that's what I'm wanting to do now, is to get your feedback on the operationalization that I developed and, sort of write that up. And what I got feedback at last night's session, the first one of these, and I promised to write up the outcomes of both sessions in terms of, a more expansive group of operationalization questions and post it up on Democracy R&D. Not tomorrow, though, probably a little bit further in the future. So the first one around inclusion, my operationalization for the purposes of my research was, I looked at who is invited, how are the barriers to participation identified and addressed, how does the selection criteria reflect the characteristics of the affected community? And I think we've already heard about, the relevance of the affected community this morning, and to what extent, I'm sorry, it says do the participants reflect the intended diversity? So at the end of the day, how, did the actual people that turned up and participate reflect those that diversity? And so when looking at all, the numerous mini-publics that I reviewed, I found that, there was quite different approaches to who was invited. So in the early days, the selection, well, no, not who was invited. There's been a couple of different approaches, emailing out invitations, posting out invitations to everyone to random selections, using, as I say, email networks and so on. Traditionally, the barriers to participation, the only one that was really identified was financial. And so an incentive was provided for people to participate. But my experience in Australia is that over time that's broadened, and now a lot more barriers are recognised, and decision makers provide support to address through translators or through hearing loops, various things. Transport to get to and from sessions. How the selection criteria reflect the characteristics of the affected community. I saw that as an important one because there tends to be a view in the deliberative area that you're recruiting just the community that's impacted, without any attention to who's most impacted. And so that was something I wanted to see, how these case studies that address that. And then obviously just, looking at the end of the day is, did it work? Did all that work towards inclusion achieve anything? So does anybody have any questions about that quickly? Yes?
Yeah. Hi. I was just wondering, this might be getting into too many details too quickly, but I was just wondering about what people might be doing in regards to age and those with less education and barriers to participation, because we find that it's young people and those from a lower socioeconomic background that we really find hard to reach. I was just wondering if you might be able to speak to that a little bit.
In the case studies, there wasn't anything specifically. Oh, there was a little bit. There were sometimes people reached out through schools and got, quite, like Goulburn Valley Water certainly did that. They reached out through schools. They're sort of they're a regional water authority, and they reached out, and there was a lot of refugee young people at schools in their region, and so they reached out that way. It wasn't something that like, I certainly am aware of things that are happening now, but it wasn't something that was specifically other than in that case, it wasn't specifically an issue in the others, although obviously age was a standard criteria, and educational attainment towards the end of so my case studies ran over about 8 years. Towards the end, educational criteria became a consideration, but it wasn't at the beginning. A lot of, and I think there are places that don't look at it now. So yeah, it's quite different. I'm not sort of like, obviously the sort of, I did identify strengths and weaknesses. So where there was selection criteria or barriers to participation beyond the financial incentive being addressed, I considered that a strength, but I didn't specifically sort of go, come out with a best practice model or anything like that for how to do it. Michelle?
Thank you. The impact question is very interesting. For myself, the question boils down to who defines the impacts? Is it the city staff?
Okay, so we'll get to that.
Okay, or is it the actual citizens? Yeah.
That'll come up in a later function.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is the first function. In a sense, I consider it an underlying thing because, who's participating, who's included, and who's supported to participate sort of starts the whole process off. What I'd like to do next, using Menti, is to get you to tell me who you would, or how you would prioritize these. If you were evaluating or even designing, what do you think is the most important, second most important element under inclusion? So just use your Menti. If you're on your phone, you can just slide them. I'm not sure how you do it on the computer. So we've only had 2 people respond to this one so far. So I'll leave this screen up for a little while you you look at that, just so that you know the next activity in Menti is going to be for you to identify additional elements that you think should be considered either for evaluation or design under inclusion. So as I said, these questions were my attempt at operationalizing inclusion, but I don't, there's no way that I think that I've, got that 100% right and that there can't be more work done. And in fact, that's the purpose of today's workshop from my perspective, is to get other people's who've got a lot of experience in this area, get their input on what we should include under each of the functions. So I'll leave that up just for a minute so that we can, we seem to have a clear front runner. So if people want to just have a little bit, just, do their prioritization there. And then we'll move on to the next question, which is, what do you think's missing? All right, well, I'm going to just move on if everybody's all right with that. So the next one is, what do you think is missing from the operationalization of the inclusion democratic function that I put together? So, what questions would you ask yourself to make sure that there was inclusion in the design and delivery of a mini public? Well, that's weird why somebody's has appeared behind somebody else's. I don't know why that's happened. So the point about how can you provide those voices that can't be involved, that'll come up in a later democratic function. There definitely is overlap between the functions. Inclusion is important for all of them. Accountability is important for all of them. So, from my perspective, the purpose of separating them in this way is for sort of analytical purposes and understanding, but there's definitely overlap. All right. So, and the one about the current issues and concerns of community members comes up specifically in the next democratic function. And that's all good. In regard to what extent does this selected group reflect the characteristics of the whole community? I think that's similar to what David said in the chat. That's quite an interesting question in one of the case study, in one of the mini publics that I looked at, which was the one in South Australia that they called a community panel. It was about the southeastern drain, which were a very expensive drainage system to allow, you know, farming and so on. The recruitment for that included people from across that area, but it didn't include people from outside that area. And, you know, the organisers in retrospect realised that they should have included people from outside the area because their taxes were contributing, whereas the community panel itself made a recommendation that the minister told them up front he wouldn't accept, and that was that the government spend another few $1 million or $1 billion supporting the drains. They didn't want to put anything in themselves. And so, you know, they were the most affected community, but they weren't the whole community, and they weren't the only ones that had, you know, should have had a say. So that was an example of where, you know, it was clear that more people should have been, like the definition of affected or whatever should have been brought up. Okay, that's a really interesting one, the one about, you know, the invitee dynamic. That's how most mini publics do work at the moment. In terms of the, when we get to collective agenda setting, which is the next one, I'll talk more about the ownership of the issues. And I haven't really ever thought of the ownership of the issues in regard to inclusion per se, but it's certainly something worth considering. So we'll just have a moment more here if there's anything anybody wants to add. I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is the next democratic function, if everybody's all right with that. This Menti apparently stays open for about 2 days afterwards, so you can go back if you're so keen. Very weird. I'm not sure what. That's not appearing on. Anyway, so collective agenda setting. This is one which doesn't happen very much, and so there is that unequal dynamic. For instance, in who chooses the topic or issues to be considered, there was only one of my case studies where had a role. Usually the topic or issue and the remit, which is the actual question people are asked to consider, is determined by the decision makers. The Goulburn Valley Water, the topics and issues were identified through a process out in the community called Water Cafe, and it was from those that the Water Authority identified topics, although you know, I wasn't able to monitor or check to what extent they, you know, which did they pick and choose amongst the things that came out of the water cafes, which were community pop-ups sort of thing. Is the remit too broad or too narrow? Because that can obviously affect the ease with which people can engage with it. And the final one is, can the mini public amend or interpret its remit? And I put that one in because not some of the Democracy Co in South Australia did allow some interpretation of remits, like when they're facilitating, they ask people to sort of, you know, agree on how they're going to approach the remit. And certainly a facilitator that I've worked with in New South Wales did that as a matter of course, so that you didn't get to the end of the process and find out that you were all on a different page in what you're actually trying to deal with. In my conclusions, I was suggesting that, you know, certainly deliberative mini publics could do a lot more in collective agenda setting. So, for instance, or just even citizens, like people could have a so we, you know, the Paris in Paris and in Belgium, other citizens do determine the topic of the I think there could be a lot more done in that area through, you know, a range of mechanisms. Certainly, like if the government wants to pick the topic or issue because they're funding this, then they could use a small mini public to determine the remit, so that the remit actually suits what people think is important. I've been to processes where people have said, this isn't the question I want to answer, you know, even though they've come along. And certainly in one of the cases in my case studies, the South Australia nuclear fuel cycle citizens jury, the government determined that the question, the remit was, what do we need to do to, you know, allow a nuclear fuel waste dump? You know, the people said, no, we don't want a nuclear, like they just ignored the question. So basically, in a sense, they interpreted it. But really, South Australia were looking at a nuclear fuel waste dump as an economic development issue. They could have, in fact, had a citizens' jury about economic development and, you know, had the nuclear fuel dump as one of the options. But they narrowed it down and they got a recommendation that they really didn't want at the time. What, you know, it was the after that jury, the South Australian government of the time didn't run any more citizens' juries, even though they were in power for a little bit longer, because they were, you know, all the other ones, they hadn't been so strong about what they wanted, but in that one they knew what they wanted and they didn't get it. So, so that's how I approached it. Now I'm going to ask you, as I did before, to identify, you know, how you'd prioritize these. Whoever it was that, can you all see that one where it says to what extent? Oh, it's gone. Fantastic. I was going to get someone just to sort of refresh their screen. So yeah, basically, I'm asking you to prioritize these, and then you'll get a chance to add other things around collective agenda setting, remembering that the next democratic function is collective will formation. And then the one after that is collective decision making, and then accountability. It doesn't bother me if, you know, you add things here that apply to others, because there is overlap. But and so in my, you know, from a normative perspective, I certainly, in terms of who determines the remit, my approach was that the more devolved the determination of the remit was, the greater that was a strength, I guess. So if you see what I'm saying, I saw that as something that I was, you know, it was a weakness if there was no way for people beyond the decision maker to, you know, have any influence on the remit. And yet, in most cases, in my experience, there is no ability for people to have an impact on the remit. And that goes in part to some of the work that I did in the research I did around institutionalism. So institutionalism, as I looked at it, and I'm just going to touch on this, was made up of rules, practices, and narratives. Now, in Australia, there's very little rules other than the Essential Services Commission for the water authorities. And now, since I did the PhD, there's the requirements for deliberative processes in Victorian local government. But I don't know why that's saying that. So there was virtually no situations where the public were involved in this. So yeah, I'm sorry, I got lost there when something told me it was frozen. So yeah, I just think other than, you know, those couple of international examples, it's generally the decision makers. Oh, and now I know what I was going to say. In Australia, one of the main narratives, institutional narratives supporting the use of deliberative mini publics, is that this is a way for decision makers to get help with tricky problems. And so that support, you know, that help with tricky problems means it's a tricky problem for the decision maker, and they decide what the remit is because they've got this tricky problem. They know what it is, they know what they want response on, and that's what they ask for. And so it isn't a normative thing. It isn't, you're not doing it to give people a say on topics that are important to them. You're getting their help. And what I also found was where, like the South Australian nuclear fuel cycle citizens jury, where the outcomes didn't help you, there was less commitment to, supporting those outcomes. All right, well, I think I'll leave that at that, and we'll go to the next one where you get to actually add some elements under collective agenda setting. So if you'd like to now just sort of identify areas where you think there needs to be, there's gaps in the list of questions, areas to turn your mind to when you're either evaluating or designing in regard to collective agenda setting. Yeah, and Kerry's put a comment in the chat about, some of the issues around the practical issues around people deciding their remit because, the people that joined up might not want to stay with that remit. I guess, my thinking was that you'd have two separate processes, one for remit and one for then the people doing it. But that's just one way. I mean, one of the things I particularly like about deliberative mini publics in this area is there's so many options for design to, make things relate to the particular topic, to the particular community, all that sort of thing. Yes, and so Michelle, that, your comments, that's what these functions address, nearly all of those things you've said that are crucial. And that's why I, used the democratic functions as a framework, as one of the two frameworks in my research, was because I felt that they did in fact address critical issues. And I did my best to operationalize them in a way that made sense, but I'm hoping now to extend that through, through this last night's workshop, through today's workshop, and I'll probably, do some other processes around that as well. Yeah. And so the question is, in terms of simply asking citizens, is do you do that through a deliberative process? Do you do that through a different democratic engagement process? And how do you actually get it down to an actual remit, which is, like a 1 or 2 questions? Yes. Well, I think, I mean, the issue about who chooses the criteria for a desirable answer, that'll come up in collective decision making in part, but that's one of the issues around whether a remit is too broad or too narrow. That's one of the reasons I included that as an operationalization, because if it's too narrow, you're more or less pushing people to a desirable answer because they haven't got much flexibility to do anything else. And if it's too broad, they probably just don't have the time to actually answer all the dimensions of the question. So again, that's why I think, there'd be value in engaging citizens in this rather than decision makers, because they can, impact the outcomes by the way they design the remit. And I mean, I don't know what people here think, but I mean, it used to be a sort of, a standard that you didn't ask a yes or no question. But I've had people debate that with me more recently. So, as the work with deliberative mini publics evolves, different people have different views on what is an appropriate remit. And I mean, I guess it is like, most of the climate assemblies that are held take as a given that there is climate change. I take as a given that there is climate change, but people who don't would say, well, that remit is, you know, preventing me from, you know, addressing the no climate change or the, you know, position. And it particularly becomes an issue when you're trying to recruit people who are skeptics to a climate assembly, and explaining to them, you know, why they should be there. So, you know, yeah, there's no sort of particularly easy answers. We've had five people respond. That seems to be the most we've been getting. So I'm not sure where some of our people are, but if you're happy, I'll go on to the next democratic function, because we have been going a little while. So the next one is collective will formation. And traditionally people would think of this as what happens in the room. But when you look at my operationalization, I go beyond that. In my thesis research, I did not look at what happened in the room in terms of the first two questions. Does the design of the deliberative mini process align with deliberative principles? And is the implementation of the process robust? I did not assess that in the cases I looked at. I was in the room for some of the mini publics, but I wasn't there for all of them. And it was just, you know, it would get too big if I was doing that as well. But in terms of the concept of collective will formation, I did ask the question, how is the will of the people outside of the mini public incorporated? Because if it was going to be collective, but it wasn't just those 40 people or those 350 people in the case of the nuclear, it was the collective. And I'm not so sure internationally, but in Australia, there tends to be, there's usually a pre-community engagement process ahead of a deliberative mini public, and the outcomes from that community engagement, whether it's public meetings, surveys, whatever, is brought together and provided to the citizens jury as part of the evidence for them to consider. So in most cases, not all of my case studies, that was done reasonably well. I also looked in terms of, you know, the idea of will formation. I also was interested in, did the mini public reach consensus? And what did consensus mean? You know, was it an 80% supermajority? Was there no particular rule set? Was there a minority report? That sort of thing. And then linking this one to the final function of accountability, I was interested in, does the mini public provide reasons for its recommendations so that the broader public knows why, you know, doesn't just see the recommendations, but sort of has an understanding of why they did that. And I looked at each case to assess whether the reports from the mini publics included the whys. One of my examiners said to me, who was not from Australia, said, what's this fixation in Australia on consensus? You know, that's old hat now. You know, consensus isn't the goal. And that's, you know, a very interesting idea, because it then links into the narratives, because the narratives in Australia are that decision makers should run these processes because they will help them solve problems. They will give them an answer. Not that they will give them a better understanding of the views of the community, but they will, you know, they will give them a set of agreed recommendations. And so, you know, I'm not sure what happens elsewhere, but that's certainly a key element here in Australia, and was a key element of the processes that I reviewed. So we're just going to go through the same thing again, asking you to prioritise the elements. So just what you think is most important in regard to collective will formation. if you were designing or evaluating a deliberative mini-public, what would you think was the, you know, if you could only look at one thing, what would be the most important, and on down the chain? And one of the things we sort of talked about last night was, you know, whether you might move the does the mini public provide reasons for its recommendations into the accountability function. As I said, there's, you know, a bit of overlap. We could put it anywhere. Well, not anywhere, but somewhere else. Does anybody need more time on this one? No, I don't want us to run over time for the whole session, so I might, if everybody's fine, I might move on to the next one, which is where I'm saying, what do you think is missing? What should I look to add, or, you know, we look to add to the collective will formation democratic function in terms of operationalising it for deliberative mini publics? Oh, yeah, so that's sort of like a deliberative poll type of process. And you certainly, I think you could apply the democratic functions to deliberative polling. In my view, you wouldn't then actually be forming a collective will, because deliberative polls don't form a collective will in the same way as a deliberative mini public does. That's my view anyway. They, you know, it's about what was the it's sort of like a survey, what was the pre and post, and did that change? And that provides valuable information for government. I certainly think it does, but it specifically is not about people forming a collective will, whereas most mini publics are about, you know, or deliberative mini publics are about forming a collective will. Yep, and I, in terms of the consensus, hidden within that operationalisation was this idea of minority reports, and that was something I looked at for each, you know, a mini public that I looked at. I've just put the link to my full thesis, if you feel like reading, you know, 106,000 words, in the chat, so you can get that there if you want. I mean, I'd suggest you just pick the bits you're interested in rather than read the whole thing, but so any other things that people think should specifically be added to operationalise collective will formation? All good, Jeanette? All right, well, if we haven't got any additions, that's nice that one didn't need much help. I'll go to the next one so we don't run out. Oh, what happened? No, I clicked too many times. All right, so collective decision making. This is, you know, obviously about decision making, but in the democratic functions, it talks about collective decision making. And there's very few, none of the cases that I studied were the deliberative mini publics given authority to make the final decision. You know, they were making recommendations. And, you know, there is quite a debate, as I'm sure everybody knows, about what should be the appropriate role of deliberative mini publics in terms of, you know, their recommendations impacting policy. or being accepted and so on. And so looking at what was the practice, so again, this one, I had a normative approach, but I wasn't pushing the envelope. I wasn't taking a stand on whether they should be accepted in total or not. So what I looked at was, or what I considered was, did the decision makers commit up front about how they would respond? So in terms of, did they make a commitment to the collective about how they would approach decision making in response to the mini public's recommendations? Obviously, did they keep that commitment? Did they do what they said they would do? Is a decision actually made, and by whom? So in some cases, like they just don't, nobody knows whether a decision was made or not. There's no reporting back, there's no accountability, and that comes up in the next function. And, to the what is the extent, not the extent, what is the extent of the actual adoption of the mini public's recommendations? My feeling is that the link between the decisions and the collective decision making is a really under considered area. Like, people are all wanting them to have more impact, but what's the appropriate impact and how it works? In South Australia, nearly all of the things had to go to cabinet and then to parliament because they were changing legislation. In other places, it's just policy change. I remember the very first citizens jury that I was involved in, doing some, pro bono research, was the Canada Bay People's Panel. They made so many recommendations, probably like Geraldton, that people at that council couldn't tell you 2 years ago how many of the recommendations had been implemented, because there was just so much and there was no clear monitoring. So, but that'll come up a little bit again in accountability. So I'm just going to move on and ask you to prioritise these. We'll just go through this fairly quickly because, we don't have a huge amount of time left. Mm. So if you want to just do your final prioritization, and then we'll move on to allowing you to add some additional elements under collective decision making. All right, we'll go on to the next one. And so what do you think's missing in terms of collective decision making? How would you operationalize it? How would you think about it in terms of designing or evaluating? Oh yeah, that's a really interesting one. And I've come across, certainly, I don't think that was really relevant in any of the cases that I looked at, but it's certainly something that, came up, for instance, in the Hobart Climate Assembly that I was involved with recently. They definitely were looking at what people could do themselves. And I think that, the climate area might be an area where that's particularly relevant, but I guess it's, it's going to be topic by topic to what extent, there's a community led element, community involvement element, as well as a government policy program element. But yeah, that's one I hadn't thought of. So any other things missing, or you've all, either it's I've done it really well or you've all run out of puff? Yeah, that's the big sort of, I guess, debate, certainly in one of the big debates in the field is, from a normative perspective, like from a, what's right, who should be the final decision maker. I've only been involved with one mini public where the decision makers said they would do whatever the mini public said, and it wasn't one in my case studies. And then when the mini publics made, 4 or 5 recommendations, they were like, "Oh, we don't like one of those." We don't really want to do that, but then theoretically everybody just ignored the fact that they'd given a commitment to adopt whatever, because it was important to us, the organisers, but it wasn't something that the participants really were aware was such an unusual thing. But they'd sort of committed more than they could deliver in the end, the decision makers. So any other things that people think should go in there? If not, we'll go to the next democratic function. And this is the final one that I used in my analysis. In my conclusion of my thesis, I actually recommended an additional democratic function of legitimacy. But because I, developed that at the end, I didn't go back and analyse all my case studies against legitimacy, plus there wouldn't have been the data really for it. So accountability, there's some commonality with some of the earlier ones. Did the decision makers give a commitment up front around how they'd be held to account, that they would provide information about their decisions, reasons, that sort of thing? Again, did they meet that upfront commitment or not, and if to what extent? Did they make their decision and reasons public? I suppose really interestingly is, do they report on the implementation? Now, in South Australia, they did a little bit of that. They certainly did a really good job with making their decisions and reasons public. Implementation, they did more than some. And the only area where they did a really good job on this, and in fact the final one of involving the mini public, was the Water Authority. And I know not only the one I used in my case study, but other ones in Victoria. The regulator, the Essential Services Commission, required them to consult customers in developing their 4-year price plan. It didn't require deliberative engagement, but a lot of them did use deliberative engagement. One of the things that was really nice about the regulator was that the regulator looked at their plans and their reports, and one water authority actually sort of got like a smack over the hand, because they did all this deliberative stuff, but they didn't actually demonstrate to the regulator that they'd incorporated that in their decision making and in their plan. So, whereas mostly there's nobody monitoring whether a decision maker does anything. And, often the people are not in a position to do that, like the community or even the mini public. And again, with the water authorities, they're required to, by the regulator, to monitor the implementation of their price plan and report publicly. And a number of them, including the one that was my case study and a number of the others, have actually included the mini public and often some new people in looking at the reports on implementation and providing feedback on whether they think, what the water authority is doing is enough or not enough. So certainly that demonstrates that those things are possible. It is possible to give a role for mini publics and community in monitoring, and it is possible to have implementation reporting. So, it would be really nice. What they did in is they didn't have them monitor it. It was like a midterm. So 2 years into a 4-year plan, they were brought back together to look at the reports. So it wasn't a sort of ongoing monitoring. And what they also did was they would approach the people that had been on the original mini public, offer them if they wanted to come along, and then they would backfill to get the same, you know, if people couldn't come along or had moved, they would backfill back from the community to get, you know, the 30-person mini public, reflecting the diversity of the community again. All right, so we'll just move on to the next. How would you prioritise these? So just another few 30 seconds here, and then we'll go on to, you know, operationalizing any, you know, things that you think should be added. All right. So, oh gosh, I'm too quick with my, oh, all right. Seems that this version doesn't have the adding. So in this one that says, ask me anything, could you actually do, you know, what you think should be added to the accountability one? My apologies for that. I copied them from, you know, I did copies, so I'm not sure where that slide went. Yep, fantastic, thank you. So I'm sorry that that's the wrong slide. Any other operationalizations of accountability that people would like to suggest? So while you're thinking about that, I just wanted to sort of tell you really, I guess, my overall conclusion in my research. In Mark Warren's work, he talks about the idea, thanks, Jeanette, the idea that, you know, the fact that you can use democratic functions to do cross-institutional comparisons and so on, and that some, you know, institutions have strengths in one area and they can be supplemented by other institutions that have strengths in other areas. And, you know, that makes sense to me. And he identifies deliberative mini publics' key strength as collective will formation. What I think and what I conclude in my thesis is that deliberative mini publics are strong in, you know, can be strong in that area depending on how they're designed, but they can be strong in other areas, you know, maybe not as strong as that, but they can definitely be strong in other areas if the design choices address, you know, the functions. Like if, you know, if you act, depending on how you design it, they can be strong or weak. And so I certainly believe that using the democratic functions as a framework when designing processes can help enhance the contribution that deliberative mini publics make to democracy overall by delivering a broader range of things rather than just what happens in the room. And, you know, I'm trying to encourage people to use the functions. I was doing talking with a client recently where I'm recruiting a mini public in Victoria, and the facilitators and I said, well, what are some of the things you know, what would success look like to you? And the guy said, well, I want the elected representatives and the participants to feel that the process was valuable. And so for me, that's, you know, that was like a confirmation that the legitimacy function, which I've added and haven't covered here, but is important, that it is important that the processes are seen as legitimate, particularly seeing as, one of the things we're trying to address is the democratic deficit, which is the deficit with representative democracy, where people aren't happy with how it works. It's very important then that we know that people are happy with how, this sort of supplementary or alternative process is working. And there's been a little bit of research around the world. I mean, you've probably seen papers about, how people feel about the decisions made by deliberative mini-publics, but we don't know a lot about it. There's a lot of talk about how, again, this comes to the narratives. There's a lot of narratives saying, that everyday people, knowing that other everyday people were on a mini-public and were given all this information, would support the decision, would be happy with it. But we don't have a lot of evidence. We have some evidence, but we don't have a lot of evidence. And the evidence that we do have is a bit, could go either way in terms of whether they're happy or not. It's the usual sort of thing. Some of them are happy if they like the decision, a bit like the politicians. They're happy if they like the decision. So yeah, it's that's sort of my conclusion. And now, as usual in a workshop, we have a feedback slide, Menti, and I'd just like you to sort of slide along there to whether you strongly agree or strongly disagree with those statements. Forget about the fact that there's a question mark in the first one. I'm not sure why I did that. Probably just got into the habit. Yes, I think it's interesting, Jeanette, not for my thesis, but in a chapter I've been updating recently, like for a second edition of a handbook about elected reps' views of democratic innovations. There was a paper I was looking at from Iceland where they've got a lot of experience with mini-publics and other democratic innovations, and the parliament were involved in approving the design and use of a deliberative mini-public. And yet when the recommendations came to them, they said, I'm not sure these people really were smart enough to handle this. Like, they didn't say it as rudely as that, but they were skeptical about the ability of the people to do it. And was the process designed well and things, and yet they'd been involved in signing off on all of it. So clearly, if politicians don't want to accept recommendations, they'll find some way around it. But again, that's where, that idea about what did they commit to up front, because then at least there's something, for advocates to hang their hat on, like if they said they would do this or that. So that's any questions or comments or anything. We're basically at the end of my presentation.
Personally, I think you've done a great job, Nivek. It's really well done.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to do it. I'm hoping to write a paper for some journal. I'm not sure what yet, but yeah, so giving a presentation on this next week at the APSA conference. Jeanette, are you coming along to that?
Yeah, I'm also doing something, so I'll probably see you there. I'm on a panel, doing a small talk on a panel.
Okay, wonderful. So anybody got any questions or comments, suggestions that you didn't get a chance to write up?
I just wanted to say thanks, Nivek, as well. It was good to meet you online. I've seen your name around the traps in Melbourne, and it's good to meet you. And thanks very much for presenting. It was really worthwhile to hear what you've been up to, and yeah, it's definitely food for thought. It'd be good to cross paths again sometime.
Yeah. I mean, I actually think democratic functions are a nice framework for not just deliberative mini-publics, but other things. Michelle?
Yes, thank you very much for having the courage to tackle this. operationalization is difficult, and you've been provocative in your presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I feel like we're on Yes, Prime Minister, where you're saying that's very brave, Minister. But yes, thank you.
Not sure if they've seen that in America,
Oh, right. Okay. No, probably not.
but I agree.
David.
I think of democratic functions as also being very relevant to the redesign of democracy in general. And I think of it as one of two dimensions. The functions is one, and something like themes is the other: environment, education, health, etc. For any one of those themes, all those functions have to happen. For any function, it has to happen across themes. That's sort of the whole space. And designing a democracy is about dividing that space up into jobs for different bodies and figuring out who does what job.
Yeah. And look, that's definitely, I think, Mark Warren's, approach to it. I mean, he, specifically says it provides that comparative, and, combining institutions with different strengths and weaknesses to, maximize. And I definitely think that. I just feel that they also allow you to actually strengthen individual institutional arrangements or institutional types to, improve them across the board by using them as a way of, assessing, some things you might not be able to do really well. Like there's some things that just, like I said, deliberative polls are probably not, achieving as much as they could in terms of collective will formation, because there's not a collective will being formed, but they're probably strong in other areas. So, but you could look at them and identify ways of, improving their strengths. Wendy.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I keep thinking is that I think that these feel like really good. The democratic functions seem like a really good way of evaluating a process or designing a process, but that it does mean that if you're going, that you have to, these mini publics have to be at scale for it to actually move the needle on democracy generally. I mean, it actually could have the opposite effect, right? Where this closed system is super democratic, but the rest of the rest of the society is going to hell around it. And so so I think, having some awareness of inside outside the the mini public world it seems kind of necessary.
Yeah, no, look, I don't I agree. I guess, within the deliberative mini public world, you'd pick some of that up in terms of collective decision making and accountability. Like if the rest of the thing was going to hell, you wouldn't have much, being able to be achieved under those two functions, because you can imagine a deliberative mini public reporting to the new incoming US government, and is there going to be collective decision making in response to that? Is there going to be accountability? No. But I definitely, my thesis was looking just at deliberative mini publics, but as I say, I believe that democratic functions can be used at a macro level, and for lots of other institutions, and it provides a nice way of doing it, rather than just going, than taking the model-based approach and saying, is representative democracy delivering at the moment? Well, yes, no, but like, what about all the other institutional arrangements?
Yeah, it's a way of getting out of that loop. I mean, which I totally understand. It just feels like, I mean, I think probably Americans it's bleak around here, right? So you're thinking, so there'd be huge responsiveness from Portland City Council to this. Meanwhile, people are being targeted and arrested. So it's just it's a string, at the multiple levels of government, and the scaling question becomes really important, I think.
Look, and I think, I mean, most of us probably are aware that the Chinese government runs deliberative mini publics.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And, I'm sort of a bit like, well, it's not a bad thing to ask the communities where they want to be located in their block of apartments. But you know, it doesn't, that's still not operating in a democracy. But it could,
Yeah.
it could in fact, you know, be strong in all these democratic functions. Like there
Right.
could be accountability, there could be, you know, they could act on the recommendations, like all that stuff could be happening. But it is still within that institution. And so I agree, like, you know, you have to look broader, not something, you know, like theses are narrow but deep.
Yeah. Right.
All right. Well, look, we're over time. So if nobody's got any other questions or comments, I'll thank you all for coming. And thank you, David, for organising it.
And thank you, Nivek. I think you did a fantastic job. This was great.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And as I said, eventually, like I'm at a conference next week, but eventually I'll write up the outcomes from both of these in terms of, you know, looking at what some additional operationalisation could be, and I'll post it up on Democracy R&D.
Make sure we catch up, Nivek.